You did not stop rescuing them because your heart became cold. You stopped because, for the first time, you saw that their helplessness was not always helplessness. Sometimes it was a method. Sometimes the crisis was real, but so was the advantage it gave them. And once you saw the advantage, your compassion could no longer remain innocent. Before that moment, every emergency seemed to contain the same silent command: come closer, understand more, give one more chance, carry what they cannot carry. Their distress reached you faster than your own doubt, and you responded before asking what part of the burden truly belonged to you. You believed this immediacy was proof of love. You thought your willingness to enter the burning room made you kinder than those who remained outside. What you did not yet see was that some people had learned to set the room on fire because they knew you would be the one to enter it. This does not mean their pain was false. Pain can be real and still be used. A person may genuinely suffer while arranging that suffering so someone else must answer for it. They may feel abandoned while repeatedly creating the conditions that make abandonment inevitable. They may fear consequences while quietly expecting you to stand between them and every consequence. Look carefully at what happened whenever you began to withdraw. The person who claimed to be powerless suddenly became remarkably capable. They could not change, but they could persuade. They could not take responsibility, but they could explain why responsibility belonged to you. They could not hear your exhaustion, yet they could detect the smallest movement of your distance. They forgot what you needed, but remembered every promise you had made during a moment of guilt. Their confusion disappeared whenever the arrangement itself was threatened. Their helplessness was selective. This was the detail you resisted because accepting it would change the meaning of everything you had been doing. As long as they were simply wounded, your role remained clear. They suffered, and you helped. They collapsed, and you carried. They became lost, and you returned them to the path. But once motive appeared, the story became more complicated. You began to see that you were not merely supporting them through difficulty, you were protecting them from the knowledge that their choices had consequences. Each rescue returned them to the same position from which the next crisis would begin. The shadow does not always appear as cruelty. Sometimes it hides inside vulnerability, where compassion is least willing to examine it. You could perceive what people felt, but you were reluctant to perceive what they wanted. You saw the frightened part inside them and ignored the part that knew exactly what it was doing. For years, you separated suffering from motive. If someone was wounded, you assumed their intentions must also be innocent. You treated pain as evidence of goodness. To question the behavior of someone in pain felt like an act of betrayal. That was the weakness hidden inside your empathy. You could feel what others were feeling, but you did not always ask where those feelings were leading you. You could sense their fear, shame, loneliness, and desperation, yet you hesitated to recognize the demand concealed within them. Feeling appeared pure to you. Motive felt darker. To recognize motive would force you to accept that vulnerability and manipulation can inhabit the same person without canceling each other. Someone can be wounded and still wound you. Someone can fear abandonment and still use that fear to control your departure. You kept your attention on their pain because the pain allowed you to remain compassionate without becoming discerning. It gave you something you could understand, soothe, and forgive. Their motive would have required a different response. It would have required distance. Distance felt cruel because you had confused closeness with goodness. You believed that seeing more deeply into another person should make you more willing to remain, but there are truths that do not deepen intimacy. There are truths that end participation, and their motive was not the most painful thing clarity would reveal. Eventually, you would also have to see what rescuing them had been protecting inside you. They called your rescuing loyalty, you called it compassion. But beneath both words was an arrangement neither of you wanted to name. They were allowed to remain unchanged, and you were allowed to remain necessary. That second truth was more difficult to face. Their motives were not the only motives becoming clear. Yours were becoming visible too. You had told yourself that you rescued because you cared more deeply than others. You believed your patience came from strength and that your endurance proved the purity of your love. Yet somewhere beneath that goodness lived a quieter need. Some part of you needed their need. Being needed gave your place in the relationship a certainty that love never seemed to provide. Love could change, affection could move elsewhere, gratitude could fade, but a crisis made you indispensable when someone was falling apart. You no longer had to wonder whether they would choose you. Their collapse chose you for them. This was the hidden security inside your exhaustion. You hated being used, but usefulness protected you from a more ancient fear. If you were no longer the one who understood, forgave, repaired, and returned, you might discover that the relationship contained very little capable of holding you there. The rescue prevented that discovery. Every emergency postponed the question of what existed between you when nothing needed fixing. You remained occupied with their pain, so you would not have to feel the emptiness beneath the bond. This is why clarity did not initially feel like freedom. It felt like guilt. You saw what they were doing, but you also saw why you had permitted it. The arrangement had wounded you, yet it had also sheltered you from the possibility of being unnecessary. To stop rescuing them meant risking the loss not only of the relationship, but of the identity through which you had learned to earn love. The psyche often protects an attachment by hiding the bargain that sustains it. You see the frightened child, the abandoned partner, the misunderstood friend, the wounded soul. You do not see the private exchange taking place beneath your compassion. I will protect you from consequence, and you will protect me from insignificance. Neither side needs to speak this bargain aloud. It lives in repetition. They return with the same wound. You return with the same answer. They promise that this time will be different. You pretend to believe them because hope allows the role to continue without appearing like a role. But repetition eventually reveals what explanation conceals. A mistake seeks correction. A pattern seeks preservation. Once you understood this distinction, you could no longer respond as though every recurrence were accidental. You began to notice that your help rarely moved them toward freedom. It moved them toward relief. Freedom would have required them to surrender something. They might have had to release a privilege, face a consequence, abandon an excuse, or confront an image of themselves they had spent years protecting. Relief allowed them to keep everything and lose only the discomfort, and you had become very skilled at removing discomfort. You calmed the conflict before it taught them anything. You repaired what their behavior had damaged. You translated their cruelty into fear, their entitlement into insecurity, and their avoidance into confusion. You made their choices easier to survive without ever requiring those choices to change. This recognition altered the meaning of your kindness. What had once felt generous now carried a darker possibility. Perhaps your rescuing was not interrupting their destruction. Perhaps it was helping the destruction continue without becoming painful enough to stop. The thought disturbed you because it made your goodness less simple. You had always wanted to be the opposite of those who abandoned people in pain. You did not imagine that remaining too quickly could also become a form of abandonment. You were abandoning their capacity to meet themselves. You stepped between them and the mirror, then wondered why they never saw their own face. You translated every consequence into misfortune. You softened every confrontation into misunderstanding. You gave their shadow a language of innocence until even they could no longer distinguish what had happened to them from what they had chosen. Jung understood that what remains unconscious does not become harmless. It gains influence precisely because no one is willing to name it. The shadow does not disappear when it is treated gently. It merely learns to operate beneath the language of goodness. Your compassion had illuminated their suffering while leaving their intention in darkness. And from that darkness, the unseen motive continued directing the relationship. When their motives finally became clear, you felt an unfamiliar stillness. It was not hatred. It was not revenge. It was the end of confusion. You no longer needed to argue with the evidence or collect one more explanation. Their behavior had become coherent. What once appeared inconsistent now followed a pattern. They were not always failing to understand. Sometimes they understood and preferred the arrangement. They were not always incapable of changing. Sometimes change threatened a privilege they did not want to lose. They were not always unaware of your sacrifice. Sometimes your sacrifice was exactly what they were counting on. The clarity hurt because it removed the version of them you had been rescuing. You had not only helped the person standing before you, you had helped the person you believed they might become if they were loved correctly. Every rescue was an investment in that imagined person. You kept giving because you believed that one day the hidden goodness would feel safe enough to emerge. One day they would recognize what you had carried. One day your patience would awaken their conscience. One day they would look back and understand that your love had saved them from becoming the person they feared they were. But your patience did not awaken what their dependence allowed them to avoid. The future version of them became the reason you tolerated the present one. You loved their potential so intensely that their actual choices seemed temporary. Yet years can be lost inside something repeatedly called temporary. When motive became visible, potential lost its authority. You saw that change was not waiting for the correct amount of love. It was waiting for a decision only they could make. Your devotion could not make that decision for them, and every attempt to do so turned care into control. This was another truth you resisted. Rescuing had allowed you to influence the ending while pretending that you had surrendered it. If you could find the right words, offer enough patience, absorb enough pain, perhaps you could guide them toward the person you needed them to become. Your care contained an unspoken demand. Become worthy of what I have given you. Prove that my suffering had meaning. Do not make me face the possibility that I sacrificed myself for someone who intended to remain exactly where they were. The more you had invested, the harder it became to stop. Ending the rescue would not only expose them, it would expose the years you had organized around their transformation. You would have to grieve not merely the relationship, but the meaning you had assigned to your endurance. So you kept misreading clarity as bitterness. Whenever you recognized manipulation, you accused yourself of becoming suspicious. Whenever you sensed entitlement, you searched for the wound beneath it. Whenever your body tightened before their name appeared on the screen, you called yourself unkind. But your body had understood the arrangement before your conscious mind permitted the understanding. It knew that every conversation carried an assignment. It knew that their vulnerability would soon become your obligation. It knew that the expression of pain was often the opening through which your boundaries would be removed. You could feel the change in your breathing before you answered them. You could feel the heaviness arrive before they explained what had happened. Some part of you already knew that the conversation would end with their burden inside your body. Still, you answered, not because you had no awareness, but because awareness threatened your identity. The rescuer was the version of you that knew how to deserve a place. Without that role, you did not know whether your presence alone would be enough. This is why the end began when motives became clear. Motive transformed the situation from tragedy into choice. You could continue helping someone trapped by circumstances. It became harder to help someone who repeatedly arranged the circumstances and then handed you the emotional cost. Once choice entered the picture, rescue began to resemble cooperation. Your guilt did not disappear, but it lost some of its innocence. You could no longer say that you were only responding to pain. You were participating in a system that required you not to know what you already knew. They sensed the shift before you spoke of it. People who depend on your confusion are often highly sensitive to your clarity. Your silence felt dangerous to them. Your pause felt like rejection. The simple act of asking what they intended to do became, in their eyes, an act of cruelty. They did not merely want empathy. They wanted empathy without discernment. They wanted you to feel the wound while remaining blind to the strategy surrounding it. They wanted the part of you that understood everything except what the understanding was costing you. They wanted your compassion separated from your judgment, because compassion without judgment could always be redirected toward their need. But something in you had begun to refuse the separation. For the first time, you allowed yourself to perceive the whole person, not only the wound, but the will, not only the fear, but the choice, not only what had happened to them, but what they continued to make happen through you. This did not erase your compassion, it purified it of blindness. You could acknowledge their pain without accepting responsibility for ending it. You could understand the origin of their behavior without agreeing to become its destination. You could see the abandoned child within them while refusing to let that child govern the life of the adult standing before you. The moment you saw this, rescuing became almost impossible, not because their pain ceased to matter, but because your disappearance began to matter too. You finally saw that every time you entered their crisis, someone was left behind. That person was you. You had called the abandonment compassion because the word made the loss easier to bear. You had called it loyalty because loyalty sounded nobler than fear. You had called it love because love prevented you from asking what the relationship required you to destroy within yourself. But clarity had changed the name of what was happening, and once the true name appeared, the old role could no longer remain innocent. And this loss of innocence did not begin with them. It began inside you, in the place where perception had once been separated from permission. You had always noticed more than you admitted. You sensed the difference between someone who could not act and someone who did not want to lose what inaction provided. But sensing a truth and allowing yourself to respond to it were never the same thing. Long before you became the person others called compassionate, you learned that motives were dangerous to name. You could notice when sadness became a weapon, when silence became punishment, when helplessness gathered attention around itself. Yet the moment you described what you saw, the atmosphere changed. Your perception became the problem. You were told that you misunderstood, that you were too sensitive, that you were imagining intention where there was only pain. The adult who frightened you became the adult you were expected to comfort. The person who withdrew love became the person whose difficult history you were asked to understand. So you learned to translate motive back into suffering. It felt safer to believe they could not help themselves than to recognize that some part of them understood the effect they were having. Their wound preserved their innocence. Your compassion preserved the attachment. This created one of the earliest divisions inside your mind. Perception continued registering what was happening, but your conscious identity was trained to distrust what the perception implied. The body registered the pattern, the mind learned to acquit it. You did not begin rescuing through action. You began by interpreting their behavior in a way that made rescuing morally unavoidable. First, you rescued them inside your own understanding. You protected them from the meaning of their behavior. You gave every contradiction a kinder explanation, every broken promise a deeper wound, every demand the language of fear. Only after rescuing their image could you rescue them from the consequences. By then, helping no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the only response available to a person who understood the situation correctly. The interpretation had already decided the action. This is why advice about boundaries rarely reached the deepest layer. The difficulty was not simply that you could not say no. The difficulty was that you had constructed a version of reality in which saying no appeared morally unjustified. If they were truly powerless, how could you leave them alone with the burden? But their powerlessness was rarely examined. You accepted their explanation of the crisis without looking at the structure surrounding it. You listened to what they said they wanted, but not to what their repeated choices protected. You measured intention by confession rather than by outcome. People do not always know their motives in a clear or deliberate way. The unconscious does not announce itself honestly. It reveals itself through what a person repeats, what they defend, what they avoid, and what somehow continues to benefit them despite their complaints. A person may sincerely say they want peace while recreating conflict wherever peace begins. They may insist they want independence while rejecting every step that would reduce their dependence. Their conscious wish may be genuine, but another wish, concealed within the shadow, may be stronger You were trained to respond only to the conscious wish. You helped the person who said they wanted to change. You did not confront the hidden part that needed failure to continue. When they returned to the old pattern, you assumed your help had been insufficient. So you gave more precise advice, more patience, more reassurance, more access to your time. You treated repetition as evidence that the wound was deeper than you realized, rather than evidence that the arrangement was serving something neither of you had named. The hidden motive was not always malicious. Often it was frightened, immature, and unconscious. They may have needed the crisis because ordinary intimacy felt unavailable to them. They may have learned that people came close only when something was wrong. Suffering became the only language through which they knew how to secure connection. But understanding the origin of a motive does not make participation harmless. This was the distinction you had avoided. You believed that once you understood why someone behaved as they did, you lost the right to protect yourself from the behavior. Understanding became a private sentence. The more you saw, the more responsible you felt. Other people could leave because they saw only the damage. You remained because you could see the frightened structure beneath it. Your insight became the argument used against your own freedom. This is how empathy turned into captivity without ever appearing cruel. No one needed to lock the door. They only needed to show you the wounded part that would suffer if you walked through it. You closed the door yourself and called the enclosure love. But their history could explain the wound without assuming responsibility for the choices being made in the present. You had been relating to what happened to them while being harmed by what they were now doing to you. Their past remained vivid. Your present became strangely invisible. Whenever you tried to bring your experience into the room, their pain expanded until there was no room left. Your hurt awakened their shame. Their shame became a new emergency. Soon you were reassuring them about the damage they had caused you. The conversation ended with you comforting the person who had crossed the boundary. They left feeling understood. You left wondering why telling the truth had made you feel guilty. This was not an accident of communication. It was the mechanism through which accountability was converted back into rescue. The moment attention approached their behavior, distress redirected it toward their wound. Your empathy followed the distress, and the original truth disappeared. They did not always plan this movement. They did not need to. A pattern can be manipulative without being consciously designed. The unconscious learns whatever protects it from an intolerable recognition. If collapse removes accountability, collapse becomes available whenever accountability approaches. Your role was to treat each collapse as unrelated to the truth that preceded it. You were expected to forget what the distress had interrupted. Their tears became the final meaning of the encounter. Their behavior vanished behind the intensity of their feeling, but feeling does not erase function. A reaction can be sincere and still serve as an escape. A person can genuinely feel overwhelmed by your boundary, while also using that overwhelm to pressure you into removing it. The sincerity of an emotion does not determine the innocence of its effect. This was the form of discernment you had been denied. You were allowed to ask whether someone was hurting. You were not allowed to ask what their hurt was asking you to surrender. You were permitted to witness the emotion but not to examine the demand concealed inside it. Once you began examining the demand, familiar interactions changed shape. The late call was no longer only a plea for comfort. It was also an expectation that your evening would remain available. The apology was no longer only remorse. It was also a request to restore access before behavior had changed. The confession of helplessness sometimes transferred responsibility. The promise to do better sometimes ended discomfort without requiring transformation. The crisis was sometimes less about finding a solution than finding another person willing to absorb the emotional weight of avoiding one. You saw how often the rescue ended exactly where their responsibility would have begun. You made the call they were afraid to make. You spoke the truth they did not want to say. You repaired the relationship they had damaged. You carried the guilt they refused to feel. Each time, the immediate tension decreased. They became calmer, and you experienced the familiar relief of having restored order. Yet nothing essential had changed. The tension had not been resolved. It had been relocated into you. You carried it afterward as fatigue, resentment, restless thought, and an obscure sense of contamination. They slept after being heard. You remained awake, replaying the problem as though it had become yours through contact. Something had been transferred. Your mind called the transfer empathy because that word preserved the image of goodness. But empathy is the capacity to perceive another person's feelings. It does not require you to become the place where those feelings are stored. Rescuing required something more than empathy. It required a confusion of boundaries so complete that their discomfort became evidence of your obligation. The worse they felt, the less choice you believed you had. Their intensity became authority. This is why some people escalated when you did not respond. A request became desperation. Disappointment became accusation. Your delay became abandonment. The emotional volume increased until you returned to the role that made the volume decrease. The pattern taught you that peace could be restored only through surrender. If you gave them what they wanted, the atmosphere softened. If you remained separate, the emotional pressure continued. Eventually, you learned to obey the pressure before it fully appeared. You answered quickly because you knew what delay would produce. You explained carefully because you knew what ambiguity would invite. You monitored their mood because the first sign of distress allowed you to prevent the larger scene. What appeared spontaneous was often highly conditioned. Your rescuing was not merely generosity, it was anticipatory submission. You acted before being asked because waiting for the demand felt more frightening than complying with it. By moving first, you preserved the illusion that the sacrifice had been freely chosen. The illusion mattered.